The jury process settings determine how the entire jury works for your call. There's a lot of settings here and a lot of configuration because it's a highly customizable experience, and every individual organization has a slightly different way of doing this. So we have quite a few options to allow a lot of flexibility. Now, by default, we recommend you leave this at just the default star rating jury system and the default single round jury. 99% of calls will run under those two modes with no need to ever change that. If you require a more advanced jury setup where you need multi-rounds, or if you want to simplify the jury, you can switch these settings, but we'll save those options for the end of this tutorial as they're very specific to very specific use cases. So let's go ahead and overview the settings and see how that affects the jury. The jury completion date and time is a date that is shown to your users when they submit. So they'll see a message that says they should expect to be notified of their jury status after this date. Now notice that users will be able to see the jury status when they log in after this date. So even if you don't send the notification emails and this date passes, when a user logs in, they'll be able to see the green or the red on their individual entries to tell them whether that submission has been juried in and juried out. If you don't want that to ever be shown to your users, you can turn on Hide Jury Status for Users, and that way the jury status will never be shown to users regardless of this date. So by default, you have a 5-star rating system. You can select the amount of stars that you would like to use, but default 5 usually works for most calls. Half-star ratings are always enabled, so even with the 5-star rating, that allows up to 10 essentially points of vote for each entry, because you can do 0.51, 1.52, 2.5, etc. If you have juror voting history turned on, this will show what other jurors have voted on individual submissions. So typically you'd want to turn this off unless you want to allow jurors to see other juror votes as they're going. Randomize orders of submissions is fairly self-explanatory. Each individual juror, if this option is turned on, submissions will be in a completely random order when they do their jurying, so that the users aren't jurying in the exact same order. If you have user agreements, you can turn those on to optionally show user agreements to jurors. You can optionally turn on Show Juror Notes to User. When a juror enters a vote, they can optionally supply a note. By default, all juror notes are private to the juror. They don't show up to anyone else, admins, users. They're only used for jurying. But if you want to, you can instruct your users to supply notes for the users. And then by turning this option on, the individual artist will be able to see the notes that the jury added on their individual submissions. By default, that's off. And again, hide juried status for user just means that this jury status date is ignored, and users will never be able to see whether submissions are juried in or juried out, even if this date has passed. Now, for those who are doing a bit more advanced jurying, you can turn on what's known as jury scorecard. And this is not a common feature, and we recommend leaving it off because it does add quite a bit of complexity and especially time commitment for your jurors. But for those who require it, you can turn on Enable Jury Scorecard. Now with Jury Scorecard enabled, you essentially can set up individual criteria and have each of those individual criteria have specific star values. Each of those star values are then totaled for an overall score for the submission per juror. I'll show you what that looks like on and off. So I'm going to turn this off, which is what we recommend by default, and I'm going to go ahead and update that. And let's go ahead and log in as a specific juror so we can see what that workflow now looks like. So I'm going to go to Tools. Let's go over here to Add New User. And I already have several juror users added into this call as tests. So let's log into this last one here. I'm going to log in as this user. So I'm literally logged in as that juror user. So this is exactly how it would look like for the juror when they log in. So you can see they'll just simply provide a note here. So they'll add note. Notes are completely optional. They don't have to. And then they'll give this thing a rank. So I'm going to come up here and let's give this 4 stars. And as soon as I click here, it's going to add that jury rating, and that submission then disappears from my pending submissions pool, and it will be down underneath my voted submissions pool. All of the settings here on how the jury process work will be shown in the video tutorial here for the juror user role. So you may want to overview that as well. However, move back to the admin user. and then turn on the criteria scorecard. So I'm going to switch back to the admin user here, and let's come back here to the jury settings, and we'll go enable the scorecard. So if I turn on jury scorecard, again, I've just got 2 criteria, I believe, here set up with different star values for each, and I'll go ahead and update my jury settings. Let's go ahead and log back in as that same juror. So under Tools, Add New User, I'll scroll down and log in as that last juror user right here that has the juror role. And now you can see I've got both of those criteria. So I provide a technical merit value, and then I also provide a artistic merit value, submit those, and then go ahead and submit that jury rating, and then it will disappear. So that's how it would look like if you have your scorecard enabled. Now back here in the admin jury settings, in the right-hand column are all of the options that you can use to set up your blind jury. So if I want to hide specific fields from my juror users, I can go ahead and hide those one by one, or I can hide all the fields altogether. Same thing with the submission fields. I can hide those one by one and turn off or on those submission fields that I need to add by default, or rather hide by default. So I'm going to go ahead and update that, and let's move back to the juror and see how that looks. So here I am logged in back as that juror user, and you can see when I try to look at the details for this submission, the title and the sale price are both hidden because I turned those off, and those are now a blind jury setting. Also note that this specific juror has access currently to all of the categories, but if I need to limit this juror to a specific category, I'll go set up that permission and then show you how they're limited here. So in the admin panel underneath the jury settings and then jury user permissions, I'll come down to that juror user right here, and I'll limit him to photographer, and I'll limit also to illustration. Let's go ahead and update that. So now that juror has a specific category limitation, and let's log back in as that juror. So we'll go to Tools, Add New User, and then back down here to that juror we've been working with in our testing. We'll log in there. And notice now this juror only has access to the photography and illustration categories. All the other submissions in any other categories are not viewable or votable for this specific juror. Last, let's look at some more advanced jury setups. So to start off, we're going to switch from a star rating to a simple rating. Now this is typically only recommended or done if you have a single juror user that's going to be doing your jurying. Now, one thing to note is that in your jury process, the juror users simply rate artworks. They don't decide what is accepted and rejected. Even if you're in the simple jury mode, where the users are selecting in or out, your juror user is selecting that, they still don't have the final say on accepting or rejecting of submissions. They simply rate the artworks, and it's the admin user's responsibility to then go and accept artworks, or jury them in as we call it, and reject artworks or jury them out as we call it, according to the specific threshold values from the juror users. So many cases in calls, the juror user also acts as a judge, meaning they're the person that's typically making the decisions on what is accepted and not accepted into the call. Even though they don't have that capability, they're still the person making that call. So in the cases for small shows where you just have a single juror and they're the person also making the decision on what is in and out, you can switch here to simple jury mode, and I'm going to update that. And now let's go back. I'm actually going to remove that jury permission. So I'm going to come down to the jury permission we set up, and I'm going to take off, delete those out of the admin user, so that admin user now has access to all the categories again. And let's now go log in and see how that looks for that juror user now that we've switched the mode. So we'll come back here and let's log in as that juror. And you can now see that I don't have a star rating anymore. I simply have jury out, jury alt, and jury in. And so the user can go in and just make those designations a little bit easier. Now, do note that while the juror user sees these simple flags, behind the scenes, they're actually logged as vote of 1 star, vote of 2 star, and vote of 3 stars. Just be aware of that. From the admin panel, you'll probably still see numbers, but the jurors will just see these simple toggles. So I can come in here and it works the same way. I can just click that one, jury in, I can jury alt, we'll jury out, we can jury in, and they would just move down through the list like so. They can always edit their votes, so when they go down to all my voted submissions, They can see all the votes they've made, and they can, of course, then update those votes as needed. So if I need to move this one to the jury in pool, I can simply move that one to the jury in pool. Your juror user can also click on the My Jury Stats. So they can see per category how many they've juried in, juried alt, or juried out, as well as how many pending votes that they haven't yet voted on, and they can see some overall totals. So for example, right now he's juried 1 out, juried 1 as alternate, 3 have been juried in, and 22 have yet to be juried. And you can see, of course, each of these also have percentages. So this is really helpful if you can instruct your juror user, if you know you have space in your gallery for 80 accepted submissions, then your juror user can come in and jury and then see exactly until they get up to the 80 juried in and make any adjustments accordingly. In simple jury mode, there are 2 differences in the admin side of things as well. And those are under the jury settings, under Jury Estimator tool. You'll see that instead of putting in a threshold value here, you simply have these toggles of jury out, or jury alt, and jury in. So if I want to see how many my juror user has marked as juried in, I can simply check these all to juried in, and it will tell me per category how many have been juried in for a total of 3 of 27. And I can switch these to the juried out and see how many are juried out, etc., etc. The other difference is in the actual marking of the submissions. So under Mark Juried Status, instead of having a threshold value where you would put in a point value, you simply say, I want to mark all categories at once as juried in, where the average jury rating is juried in. And then you just click Mark Entries, and that will jury all those in. I can jury out everything by clicking Mark Entries this way, and then move all my alternates, if you're using alternates, which are extremely rare, to Mark Entries as well. So that's the one difference here in the mark settings, is you don't have the threshold value either. Now let's move back and look at the advanced options. So we're going to go back to the juried process settings, and we're going to move over into the star rating system, and now we're going to talk about jury rounds. So I'm going to update these to move back into the default star ratings, and you can use jury rounds as well with simple if you want. But jury rounds are an advanced way of doing jurying where you want to move submissions from pool to pool to pool to sort of narrow the pool as you go accordingly. So by default, most calls will simply use a single round jury where you'll have a pool of jurors. They'll all rate your artworks according to different criteria. And then you as the admin user, of course, will then come in and determine those cutoffs. So you'll punch in values here. For your star, I'll just do 2 for all of these. And this will average all of the votes between all of the users and tell you how many submissions are greater than 2. And you can see for the fine art category, there are 6 current submissions that are greater than 2. So if I was to use that as my threshold, 6 entries would be juried in this category. Now, optionally, and this comes into play when you have maybe a large pool of submissions. Let's say you have 1,000 submissions, and that's too much work for a single person to do, or maybe you want to split that workload up, or maybe you want to have one juror do a first pass, and then a second juror will do a second pass, or something like that. So what you can do is you can advance submissions from round to round accordingly. So for example, if I come over here to my jury process settings, and right now I'm currently in the single round, which is the default round 1. So let's say I want to move all entries to round 2 instead of doing the jurying. So what I would do is when I come to the Mark Juried Status, I would say, okay, I'm just going to do all categories at once here. And I'm going to move these to round 2, where the average rating is greater than, let's say, 2. Okay? And notice this will only affect all of the entries that are currently in jury round 1, which is the default jury round. So I'm going to mark all these entries, and you'll see that that just moved 19 submissions into round 2. So now when a juror user logs in, they will only see submissions in the current jury round. So if I was to come to my jury process, and now I'm going to activate round 2 as my current jury round. So I'm going to go ahead and say update jury settings. And now I'm going to go and log in as a juror. And essentially all of the tools and all of the jurying now will only work for entries that are currently in round 2. So let's go back to tools. We'll say add new user, and I'll log back in here as the admin user. and you'll see that I'm currently in jury round 2. And so I'm only going to be seeing submissions, or this juror will, that are in round 1. So even if they already voted in round 1, now that round 2 is active, I won't see all those initial submissions. So essentially it's a restart. So I can now revote on all of these submissions. All of the round 1 votes are kind of ignored at this point because it's kind of a new start. So I'm only seeing entries in round 2, so I can vote away. I can go to all my voted submissions, and you can see these are all the submissions that I've voted on that are currently in round 2. And now when I come back and log back in as the admin user, all of the tools underneath the jury settings, so the jury mark status, the jury estimator tool, these are only taking into account the submissions that are currently in round 2. So I'll just do the number 1 here for all of these to see a threshold value. And you can see I'm currently seeing 12 entries of the 21 entries that are in round 2 are above these thresholds. Now I can come over here to my mark juried status. And I can say, okay, I want to do all the categories at once. And here now you have the option. So you can alternatively advance these to round 3. And then if you're currently in round 3, you can advance them to round 4. And if you're in round 4, you can advance to round 5, up to 6 total rounds. Most people will only need a single round. Some people maybe need 2 rounds or 3 rounds, but it would be very rare that you would need to go above that. But you do have the option of going to a full 6 rounds. So maybe at this point I'm happy with the results, so I need to then jury the submissions that made it into round 2. Those that are above the threshold from round 2, I need to mark as juried in. So I'd say, okay, jury everything in that's greater than 1. And remember, this will only affect entries that are currently in round 2. So I'm going to say mark entries, and it's going to mark all those entries and jury those in. And then I would need to jury out everything where the threshold is lesser than, I don't know, we'll say 0.99 or something like that. And mark those entries, and nothing is less than that, so nothing was marked. So when I come over here to my data and my submissions, you'll see that now I've got all these entries that are juried in because those were all juried in from round 2. Now a few other little features here is if you need to reset the jury process, you can do that. So if you accidentally made a mistake and you've kind of got the statuses messed up, you can mass reset all your submission statuses. And this will essentially take everything that's juried in or juried out or juried alternate and set them back to pending. So if I click mass reset all submissions and hit OK, that will essentially take all the submissions that currently have a rating and it put them back to pending. So now when I go back to my data submissions, you can see that everything is now pending. Nothing is juried in or juried out or juried alternate. The rounds are still active. So these submissions are still in round 2. All of the votes that the jury users voted on are still present and active. I've just simply reset the status. So then if I need, I can go back and rejury in or jury those things out. You can also mass move submissions between rounds. So maybe I want to take everything that's currently in round 2 and move it to round 1. I can just move all of those entries all at once, and all those 21 submissions that were in round 2 are now back in round 1. If I then moved them back to round 2, they already have votes logged on them in round 2. So typically you wouldn't need to do this unless you have a specific reason to move submissions. And then lastly, if you just want to mass jury in all submissions, even those submissions without any jury votes at all, you can do that all at once. So occasionally calls don't actually have a juror. They just accept all of the entries. And so if you have that instance where you need to accept all entries but you're not voting on them, you can just mass jury in everything. So I can just click this option and hit OK. And you can see this is going to jury in every single submission into my call, even if it doesn't even have a vote. So now when I go to my data and I look at my submissions, everything is essentially juried in. So those are a few of the options underneath the advanced settings for your jury the jury rounds. So everything is sort of just based on that current jury round, right? If I'm in jury round 3, I can modify and manipulate the submissions and their statuses that are currently in round 3. Now, lastly, if that wasn't complex enough, there's one additional feature here that we have that comes into play when you have what we call clamping. So inside of the jury permissions, by default, you can limit users to categories, but you can also limit users to specific ID ranges. So we call this clamping. And this is very rare, but it comes into play occasionally when you have a very large amount of submissions, but you want to have individual jurors jury a specific set of submissions, but they need to see all categories. So this is helpful when you have one specific expert per category, but what if you have 3 jurors and you have 1,000 submissions, and each juror you've determined are going to look at 333 each? In that case, you would set up clamping. So for example, I can set this guy, and we automatically put in the numbers to equally distribute the submission. So by default, you would probably just use the numbers that are shown here. So I'd set this one to 1 and this one to 15, because this will automatically distribute all of these entries. So I'm going to punch all these numbers in here and show you how this works. So essentially now I'm limiting this last admin user. He's only going to see submissions that have an ID between 46 and 60 within all these categories. Okay. So I'll go ahead and update this, and let's go ahead and log in as that user. So I'll go down to Tools and we'll say Add New User, and we'll log in here as the admin user. And you can see that there are no pending submissions, but if I go to the voted submissions, there's no voted submissions either. The reason why I'm not able to see anything here is because I have round 2 jury active. So let's go back and turn on the default round. So let's go back and let's go to the jury status, and the jury settings. Let's set this back to the default round here. And that looks good. So remember, we moved all the submissions from round 2 into round 1, so there's nothing in round 2, which is why that was blank. So now let's go back and log in again here. So let's log back in as that admin user. Perfect. So you can see the ID is now 55, meaning that's the lower clamp, and the upper clamp was that higher end. So now I'm only seeing the submissions within that range. So now I can do my voting and vote accordingly. Now, if you are using clamping, there will be one issue you'll have to address as the admin user, and I'll show you that. So if you have the jury permissions set up with clamping, the jury estimator tool will look slightly different as well. And it will give you this new section down here at the bottom that says Jury Estimator with Clamping. You can see that in clamping, you have the range estimate. So this way, this allows you to then jury in according to your ranges with very specific values. So now I can say, okay, I'm going to jury in all categories as juried in where the average jury rating is greater than 1 for submissions 1 through 15. And maybe that 1 value is going to give me 25 entries. But for juror number 2, who is only jurying 16 through 30, I need to maybe use the value of 3 because his averages were different, and that's going to give me 25 submissions. And then for juror number 4, maybe his average was 5. He voted 5 for everybody, and that's going to give me 20 submissions for him. So in other words, you can clamp the submission ranges by juror, and you can see those values in the Jury Estimator tool. So when you come to Jury Estimator tool, this will allow you to see specific values for each juror to see how their numbers differ as far as the averages go. So that is quite complex, but in certain circumstances where you're setting up those jury clamping, those extra little features that are new will greatly help you get a better juror pool and do your mass jurying.